These are the higher-ups.
Well, he's a higher up too. I mean, you know.
Not like this, you know. Oh, come on, Frank. If they can whack a president, they can whack a president of a union. You know it, and I know it.
By October of 1963, the walls were closing in on everyone. Joseph Valachi had gone public before the Senate, laying out the inner structure of organized crime for the entire country to see. It wasn't theory anymore, it was testimony, sworn and televised. For Valachi, it was personal. The world he'd joined in the 1930s had changed beyond recognition. For the mob, secrecy was everything, and suddenly the whole hierarchy was being sketched out in black and white on America's TV screens. The hearings began in September, and by mid-October, CBS was already filming a 1-hour special. On October 15th, as the cameras rolled and Valachi named names, another small event took place, one that seemed meaningless at the time but would change history. That same day, Ruth Payne told Lee Harvey Oswald that her neighbor's brother worked at the Texas School Book Depository, and that they were hiring. Oswald had just returned from another failed job hunt in Dallas. She called on his behalf. He went down to 411 Elm Street, filled out an application under Lee H. Oswald, and was hired on the spot. He'd start the next morning at $1.25 an hour, about $12.80 in today's money. To most people, that was just a man getting a job. But in the larger story, it was the beginning of the end. Oswald believed he was still on a mission to reach Cuba. David Atlee Phillips, the CIA's man for Cuba and Mexico, had coached him in how to move, how to act, how to shoot from elevation at a moving target. Training meant for Havana, not Dallas. Phillips would later say he couldn't understand how Oswald could have turned that same training on Kennedy. But Oswald, back in Dallas, was waiting for new instructions. He still thought he was on assignment. What he didn't know was that the world around him had shifted overnight. By late September, the Valachi hearings had begun naming familiar names. Marcello, Trafficante, Giancana. The underworld was being dragged into daylight. The mob saw what was coming. The Kennedys weren't just going after Cuba, they were going after them. They'd already forced out Allen Dulles and were setting their sights on J. Edgar Hoover. They wanted to dismantle the CIA's shadow networks, the ones tied to industry, covert operations, and organized crime. For the men who built those networks, that couldn't happen. Meanwhile, in Miami, mob-connected gambler and CIA asset John Martino was having dinner with his son when a Dallas radio broadcast announced Kennedy's upcoming visit. Martino froze, turned to his boy, and said quietly, "If Kennedy ever goes to Dallas, they're going to kill him." On November 22nd, that prediction came true. That same day, while the president's motorcade was weaving through downtown Dallas, Carlos Marcello, David Ferry, and Guy Bannister were in court in New Orleans, fighting charges over forged birth certificates and Marcello's illegal deportation to Guatemala, ordered personally by Robert Kennedy. When the shots rang out in Dallas, Marcello was exactly where he wanted to be, on record, under oath, with witnesses. But from that moment forward, the names tied to Marcello's world began surfacing, slowly at first, then one by one. The House Select Committee on Assassinations would spend decades dragging them into hearings. Trafficante, Giancana, Campisi, Rosselli. Some never made it that far. Giancana was shot before he could testify. Jimmy Hoffa vanished. Martino was murdered. Johnny Rosselli talked too much, admitting under oath that he'd used Santo Trafficante as his translator in CIA Mafia meetings, and it ended up floating in a steel drum off Miami in 1976. In Dallas, the Campisi brothers ran the Egyptian Lounge, a quiet meeting spot for cops, bookmakers, and mobsters. Their friend, Joe Civello, was the local boss, but everyone knew his leash led straight back to Marcello in New Orleans. Together, they held influence over the city's politics and its richest patrons, oilmen, real estate magnates, and gamblers like the Murchison family. Dallas looked clean on the surface, but underneath it was a southern outpost of Marcello's empire. Oswald, back from Mexico City, found himself surrounded by familiar faces: David Ferry, Guy Bannister, Lauren Hall, Sergio, Arcacha Smith, Jack Ruby, and the Campisi family. They all moved in the same orbit, tied together by the same networks of Cuban exiles, intelligence fronts, and mob-controlled businesses. After the Valachi hearings, the calculus changed. Killing Castro no longer mattered. The revolution in Havana had already eaten the casinos, but Kennedy had gone further, threatening the very foundation of the alliance between organized crime, the CIA, and the industrial world that had profited from war and secrecy since World War II. By mid-November, the plan had shifted. The bounty on Castro's head was pocket change compared to what Kennedy's death would bring. Then the final piece fell into place. The Dallas newspapers printed the exact motorcade route. Oswald saw it with his own eyes. He knew the turns, the angles, the distance from his sixth-floor perch to Elm Street. He was told to wait until the car cleared the corner, to shoot once the president's back was exposed, not head-on. At 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, the shots rang out. Whether Oswald hit the target himself or was backed by others in Dealey Plaza didn't matter. The result was the same. Kennedy was dead. The cover story was ready, and the patsy was in handcuffs. From there, everything began to unravel, slowly, over decades. But the same names kept circling back. Ferry, Bannister, Hall, Trafficante, Marcello, Hoffa, Roselli, Bufalino, and the Campisis of Dallas. Each one in some way connected to that day in November. Each one part of the same hemisphere of power that had decided one thing above all, that John F. Kennedy had to die. In October 1963, Carlos Marcello sat in his baronial estate at Churchill Farms, eyes fixed on the flickering television. Across the country, Americans were watching the same broadcast, the first time the veil had ever been pulled back on their invisible government. Joseph Valachi, a stocky, nervous soldier in a cheap suit, was spilling blood with words. He told the world about secret societies, men who pricked their fingers and swore oaths over pistols and saints. He named names: Gambino, Lucchese, Luciano, Masseria, Maranzano, men who built America's real shadow government. He even spoke about the Chicago outfit, about the reach of the underworld from New York to Tampa to New Orleans. Marcello watched it all in silence, a cigar burning to ash in his hand. Around him sat his lawyer, Ray Gill, his longtime associate Michael Maroon, and a few trusted hands. Across from them, two private investigators, David Ferry and Guy Bannister. Both ex-G men, now working the darker side of the law. They'd been hired to dig into Marcello's federal case, part of a legal army that included Irving Davidson and Jack Wasserman, the dream team of mob defense. Wasserman was the most powerful immigration lawyer in America, defending everyone from Russell Bufalino to Carlo Gambino. If Marcello's trial had gone ahead on November 22nd, 1963, it would have been a national event, a media circus. But that day would turn into something else entirely. Gill leaned toward him. "You believe this crap?" Marcello didn't answer. His jaw tightened. "Last time they came for us like this," he finally said, "it was New Orleans. 1891. They lynched 11 Italians and called it justice. Now it was happening again, only this time the hangman was on TV. Valachi had taken America's oldest secret and handed it to the cameras. Every name, every code, every initiation. And to Marcello, that was betrayal. The strong ones, the real bosses, had held the line for 70 years. Now the streets were talking again. Chicago had been forged in blood, Capone's men mowing down anyone who didn't fall in line. Accardo, Rica, and Giancana had built an empire out of violence and politics. New York was chaos, the 5 families born from the corpses of Masseria and Maranzano. When Anastasia was murdered, Gambino stepped in. Genovese was framed and locked away. The table was set. Everyone knew it, but no one had ever said it out loud, until Valachi. And in that moment the world met La Cosa Nostra. Marcello sat back in his chair. He knew what came next. When the secrets start spilling, blood always follows. Across the country, in Tampa, Santo Trafficante watched too. He and Marcello were old friends, old rivals, tied by money and murder. The Chicago bosses kept their city locked down. New York was divided by bloodlines and betrayal. But in Louisiana and Florida, the rackets were international. They weren't just moving money or drugs, they were moving politics. By now the mob had gone global. The Jewish syndicates were in lockstep. Lansky, Nig Rosen, Mo Dalitz, Longy Zwilman, the Dorfmans. They handled the money, the casinos, the insurance, the banking. The Italians ran the streets, the Jews ran the numbers. Meyer Lansky had built the blueprint. From bootlegging Luciano in 1931 to building casinos in Havana and Vegas, he turned organized crime into a corporation. Offshore accounts in Switzerland, investments in Cuba, loans through the Teamsters Pension Fund. He was the mob's accountant, the man who taught them how to wash $1 billion clean. Longy. Zwilman ran Newark like a fiefdom, owning pieces of Columbia Pictures before dying in 1959, a suicide that fooled no one. Mo Dalitz turned Cleveland's bootlegging money into Vegas gold, financing the Desert Inn and the Stardust with Hoffa's Teamster millions. Harry Nig Rosen pushed heroin through Philadelphia, his French Connection routes protected by the same men who owned the docks. Then came the Dorfmans, Paul and his son Alan. Paul built the bridge between the outfit and the Teamsters, creating a network of labor fronts that turned the mob's rackets into legitimate business. Alan took it national. He managed the Teamsters' $1.3 billion pension fund, a war chest that financed Vegas, Miami, and Phoenix. Dalitz got loans. Korshak got contracts. Hoffa got power. And Alan Dorfman got rich, the same kind of rich Lansky had become in Havana. Behind them all, in the south, another power was rising, the one that made Marcello's empire possible. In 1932, Louisiana's kingfish, Huey Long, had cut a deal with New York's underworld. Long wanted control. Frank Costello wanted expansion. They shook hands, and New Orleans became a gateway. Costello saw what others missed: shipping. He knew the liquor routes could turn into trade routes. Prohibition had forced the mob into logistics, and logistics would make them legitimate. By the 1940s, they controlled ports, trucks, and railroads. They owned gas stations because they remembered where their trucks used to break down. They took New Deal contracts, ration stamps, food distribution, everything the government touched. Roosevelt thought he was saving the economy. In truth, he was feeding the mob. That's how Marcello's world was built, from liquor to oil, from produce to politics. They'd built a parallel economy, one that worked better than Washington's. And when the mob moved south, they found allies in the Jewish power brokers who already ran the banana trade. Sam Zemurray, Sam the Banana Man, was one of them. Born in Bessarabia, he built United Fruit into an empire that spanned 9 countries. He ran a private army, toppled governments, and controlled 1 million acres across Central America. His company operated 65 steamships, 2,000 miles of railroad, its own radio network, commissaries, hospitals, even a snake venom lab. United Fruit was more than a company. It was a government, and Zemurray was its president. When dictators got in the way, he removed them. When he wanted new laws, he bought them. He paid double the army wage and moved nations like chess pieces. And behind him, watching closely, were the men who would build America's real secret power, the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA didn't come out of nowhere. It was born out of the OSS, Wild Bill Donovan's wartime spy shop. Donovan, a Wall Street lawyer turned spy master, had built his team out of Ivy Leaguers, bankers, and lawyers from the same white shoe firms that represented United Fruit, Standard Oil, and the biggest corporations in the world. One of them was Allen Dulles. During the war, he ran OSS operations in Switzerland, cutting deals with Nazis and bankers alike. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. Together, they turned U.S. foreign policy into a corporate protection racket. Sullivan and Cromwell represented United Fruit, ITT, Standard Oil, and J.P. Morgan. Frank Wisner built the CIA's propaganda machine, the mighty Wurlitzer, he called it, using journalists, publishers, and artists to sell the agency's version of the truth. James Angleton handled counterintelligence, building alliances with Israel, the Vatican, and organized crime. He ran secret banks, secret assassins, and secret wars. They had partners: Nelson Rockefeller, Robert Lovett, the Rockefellers Foundations, Henry Luce's media empire, and Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew and the father of public relations. Bernays had worked for United Fruit, crafting the propaganda that justified its coups in Latin America. When the CIA overthrew Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, it wasn't about communism. It was about bananas. It was about Zemurray's empire. That was the bridge: corporate power, government muscle, and organized crime. The banana men, the Dulles brothers, the mob bosses, they were all part of the same network. By the early 1960s, those networks had merged. United Fruit's ships were still moving cargo. The CIA's planes were running guns and dope. The Teamsters' funds were building casinos. The same handful of men, Zemurray, Lansky, Dulles, Marcello, Hoffa, were running America's true business: power. And sitting in front of that television, as Valachi exposed their world to the nation, Carlos Marcello finally understood what he was watching. It wasn't just one man ratting out the mob. It was America's invisible government, the one they'd all built together, finally coming into the light. By 1962, Oni Madden was the last old-timer still holding court in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Aristocrat of organized crime, English-born on Christmas Day 1891, he'd come up as boss of the Gopher Gang in Hell's Kitchen, fought bloody wars with the Hudson Dusters, and outlived most of the Prohibition generation that tried to kill him. Police accused him of 6 murders. Sing Sing took 8 years of his life for the Little Patsy Doyle hit. He ran a brewery at 10th Avenue and 24th Street that threw off 300,000 gallons of beer a day and $1.5 million in equipment. New York called him the Clay Pigeon after he got shot up in a nightclub and lived to see his shooter end up dead. His associates read like the roll call of the era: Legs Diamond, Mad Dog Coll, Big Frenchie Demange, Dutch Schultz, Bo Weinberg, Chink Sherman, Larry Fay, Vannie Higgins, Frank Yale. When the heat got impossible, he did what smart bosses do. He disappeared without leaving town. In 1935, he retired to Hot Springs, scarred by bullets, and built a quieter empire under steam and mineral water. Leo McLaughlin ruled the city like a circus mayor. Madden became the gentleman patron. He wore a muffler to hide the scars on his neck, played occasional golf, gave to youth charities, chatted nightly at a downtown bar, looking like a tourist. His next-door neighbor was the police chief, John Ermey. He never bragged. When New York cops pinched him at Madison Square Garden in 1950 for vagrancy, association with men of criminal record, a magistrate tossed it, "New York ain't New York anymore." On another visit, asked to explain himself, Madden told the arresting officers, "I am a mineral water salesman from Oklahoma," and was put on the next plane out. Fiorello LaGuardia ordered him arrested for vagrancy every time he set foot in Manhattan. It didn't take. He could be icy in the right room. A reporter once came to his office in the Longacre building over a padded nightclub tab for a society friend. The office was spare, the desk clean. Madden listened, asked for details, then produced a waiter with $21.90 in cash and a replacement notice. "My name is Mr. Madden," he said calmly. "You won't be adding at all for a while." To the reporter, he offered a primer. Every nightclub was an incorporated company. The principals were on file in Albany. He kept a book in the drawer if anyone wanted to copy names. Later, he made a show of stopping by that newsroom, quiet voice, proper English, so the kid would be seen talking to Oni Madden. The kid got a raise the next week. Hot Springs turned into more than a retirement home. It became a sanctuary, safe house of kings. When word reached Charles "Lucky" Luciano in the mid-1930s that the Waldorf Astoria bellboy had tipped police to an arrest warrant tying him to prostitution and narcotics, he didn't call his lawyer. He ran, down to the garage, into a car, across the river to New Jersey. There he swapped vehicles, took travel money from Longie's Willman, and drove straight to Arkansas, to Oni. On April 1st, 1936, New York Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey announced Luciano's arrest at Hot Springs on compulsory prostitution charges, calling him the head of New York Vice. Papers paired it with the day's other chase, state police and federal men combing woods near Malvern for Alvin Campisi, public enemy number 1, after a raid at the Fairchild place by Lake Catherine. Gas bombs, tear gas, a house shot to splinters, agents posted on the hill, and the press told they'd hear nothing until Mr. Hoover makes an announcement. Hot Springs was where public enemies went to breathe. Sometimes they got caught. Often they didn't. Madden's obits would later say he died quietly in Arkansas in his 70s, chronic emphysema at 12:10 a.m., ending 30 years of retirement. They called him a killer and racketeer who ruled by terror. They also noted the donations to boys' clubs, the Soft Voice, 2 marriages, Agnes Demby, his second, married December 3rd, 1935, the citizenship he never bothered to take until late, the habit of avoiding cameras. They mentioned Frank Costello visiting him on occasion. They didn't need to explain why. If you were a New York boss with problems, Hot Springs had solutions. By the early 60s, the clock ran out on Oni's model. The city still had steam, but the line of succession had shifted. The New York families wanted Arkansas kept steady, casinos open, the racing wire humming, numbers clean, unions quiet. Their point man was Carlos Marcello of New Orleans. He held the keys to the Lower South and the Gulf, bookmaking, jukes, docks, produce, oil, the trucks that fed the states and the hands that unloaded them. As Madden faded into the wallpaper, Marcello's people took the corner booth. The money stayed the same. The names on the envelopes changed. On October 3rd, 1963, the President of the United States flew into that world to sell a different story. John F. Kennedy dedicated Greer's Ferry Dam and called it the symbol of a new South, federal-state cooperation, growth in industry and education, one nation under God, indivisible. He praised Arkansas's delegation, Fulbright on foreign relations, McClellan on government operations, Wilbur Mills steering a $11 billion tax cut, Orrin Harris pushing medical colleges, Jim Trimble on rules, E.C. Gathings on agriculture, pound for pound, the most powerful in Washington. He told Little Rock, still haunted by 1957, that the Old South's problems weren't over, but a new South was rising every day. Standing 5 feet away, Governor Orville Faubus answered with a backhand. Civil rights, he said, threatened jury trials, private business, states' rights, a civil wrong. The crowd at the dam stayed mostly silent. A later audience at the fairgrounds applauded the president. Sailboats cut the reservoir. The dam's 1,700 feet of concrete shimmered in Ozark sun. Kennedy spoke of projects that protect and create wealth, of steel in Pittsburgh, autos in Detroit, shoes in Massachusetts linked to water over Arkansas Rock. He was polite about Faubus and didn't bite. Then he helicoptered off and flew back to Washington. That was the public script. The other one never got read into the record. While the president blessed the New South, the old one still moved in the shadows. Casinos, wire rooms, union boards, back bar cash boxes, slots that had been Oni's and now answered to New Orleans, with New York nodding along. Hot Springs, the place where Lucky once hid and Campisi once slipped, had not changed its function. It still offered cover. Only the steward had changed. Oni Madden's legacy wasn't headlines or body counts. It was a template. Retire early, keep the police chief next door, make the trains run on time, settle tabs before they turn into cases, and turn a gangster's city into a gentleman's spa. When the era rolled forward, the system kept running under a new manager. Luciano had trusted it in 36. By 63, Carlos Marcello owned it. And while the president talked about dams, the men who ran the night still counted the day's take. Quietly, efficiently, the way Oni taught them. Coming into November, Carlos Marcello kept the doors shut and the circle tighter. David Ferry and Guy Bannister were in and out, and the lawyers in Washington, the heavy hitters, worked one job only. They were stitching together a coalition, the most radical cutouts from Operation Mongoose and the exile networks, far-right money and high-ranking agency hands, not just the men who built the CIA, but the loyal clerks who did their bidding. Placement and timing were everything. So was blame. One night in October, the room thinned to 3. Marcello, Ferry, Bannister. Bannister ranted about the Bay of Pigs until it wound Ferry like piano wire. Marcello stayed fixed on the television, the damage Valachi had done. Names, rights, structure. The avalanche had buried New York and Chicago in headlines. But Valachi had nothing real on the South. Those outfits were older, quieter, and sealed off. That was Marcello's edge. The Justice Department could feed Valachi scoops all day. It still couldn't see into Churchill Farms. The FBI had never held Marcello under steady glass. He was too disciplined. His war was in court, the deportation, the immigration fight. And he planned to beat Robert Kennedy on paper while the other war moved in shadows. Everything pointed to a single date, November 22nd, 1963. Marcello lived by the old math. 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. Oswald had to be kept close, and Oswald had to die. On the day itself, there was no reason for Ferry to be in New Orleans. The local pieces were finished. If the job ran right, Oswald would never need a ride out of Dallas. He'd never see a runway. Ferry knew what Oswald trusted. From the time the kid was a teenager, Ferry had been the mentor, the oddball pilot with the answers. If Oswald were going to take a proposition this big, he'd want eyes he knew. That's why when they pulled him in, Oswald had a revolver stuffed in his back pocket. Ferry would have told him never trust the pickup team, especially Dallas cops. Sit behind them. Keep your hand near the gun. Any fast move, you put one in the seat. That was the instruction set. The real plan was simple. Grab the patsy, drive him to an empty place, end it, and let the exiles do the talking. John Martino, the DRE boys, the Miami loudmouths, blame Castro, demand payback, let the papers print the cue. The agency would keep the orchestra in tune, but the arrest blew the timing. The minute Oswald got caged, Marcello knew the next move. Ruby would have to go in. Ferry understood what that meant, and when he understood it. Marcello told him straight, "You're not going to Dallas. You stay in New Orleans. Oswald isn't flying anywhere. He's dead." That's when Ferry realized he'd delivered a kid he'd known for years into a mechanism that didn't return merchandise. Marcello wasn't a man who played games. You sat there. You took the order. You survived the day. The pressure that fall wasn't only in Dallas. September into October, the Kennedys hit like a fighter finishing his early rounds. Not the knockout yet, but enough to swell the eyes. They'd ride out 1963, retool for 64, and sell re-election. The plan ran through Labour and the mob, weaken unions, cut Jimmy Hoffa off at the knees, stack investigations, and turn Valachi's testimony into a national mugbook. It put people in corners, union halls, city agencies, and committee rooms, and it painted targets on New York, Chicago, and Florida. That was the pattern since Roosevelt and Kefauver. Hammer the big stage syndicates, miss the rooms off stage. Then Jack Kennedy went into those rooms. Visits to states that weren't used to federal daylight, and didn't grasp how fast the local weather could change. Dallas was a thicket. Far-right oil and country club politics on one side, serious mob money on the other, often in the same living rooms. The outfit had fingerprints there. So did New Orleans. The men tied to Marcello's line in Dallas were the quiet kind: Joseph Civello, Sam Civello, Joseph Ianni, Jimmy Maggiotto, Rosario Musso, John Patrona, Peter Pellegrino. After the shooting, the Bureau finally drew the map and circled the names. What people don't talk about: the first wave of warrants went broader than the papers printed. One name on the list was David Ferry. Investigator, pilot, and reliable cutout. Hauled into the light and then eased back out. Another was Bannister, the ex-FBI chief out of New Orleans, who still had friends in the building and a line to Hoover's people. Pressure? Yes. Consequences? Not for them. Ferry's CIA ties and Bannister's bureau pedigree gave Marcello the cover he needed. The problem he didn't need was Oswald still breathing. Time dragged. Then the focus crept back to the underworld anyway, the long tail, the way these things do when committees are formed and witnesses get sworn. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations started grinding in the late 70s, Dallas and its syndicates came under oath, along with Marcello's lattice, the Campisis especially. Joe Campisi's record told the story of how Dallas really worked. 5'5", 190 pounds, born in 1918, brown eyes, black hair. He and his brother Sam ran the Egyptian Lounge at 5610 East Mockingbird Lane. Before that, it was the Idle Hour Bar. Alongside it, the Par 5 Club, a private room for the regulars. The Egyptian threw off real money. In 1960, each brother told the Bureau they took home $42,000. By 67, a friend, Tony Todora, put the skim closer to $100,000 each per year. When Sam died in 1970, Joe paid his widow $200,000 in a settlement 8 years later. That's not diner cash, that's a machine. The machine had gears elsewhere. Joe helped promote gambling junkets to the Flamingo in Vegas until ownership changed in 67. He filed to sell casualty insurance as Joe Campisi and Associates. He cultivated judges and the DA's office, waited out sheriffs, and watched the bookmakers' fortunes rise and fall with local elections. Arrests: 1. Murder, July 29th, 1944. He shot an employee who pulled a knife. The grand jury called it self-defense and no build it. On paper, federal files waffled on whether he was definite, suspected, or negative OC, but the associates list was clean enough. He was close to Joe Civello when Civello ran the Dallas family. He ran the front room, kept the back room calm, and stayed off blotters that stuck. And then there was Ruby. Joe said he knew Jack since 47 or 49. The contact points were public. Ruby's carousel or Vegas clubs, the Egyptian for steaks, ball games. Except Ruby thought enough of Joe to ask for him in jail after he shot Oswald. The statements on money don't line up. In November '63, Joe told the FBI Ruby ran on cash and carried his take in his pocket. Later, he couldn't remember saying it. Then on December 7th, he said he'd never known Ruby to carry large sums and was surprised he had so much when arrested. Socialize or not? Joe first said he never did. Elsewhere, he admitted Ruby once came by his house. That's the Dallas style: deny, narrow, adjust. By May 22nd, 1978, Joe was sworn in at the federal building in Dallas, Magistrate Courtroom 16 F23. With senior counsel John Hornbeck and staff counsel Donald Purdy questioning. The HSCA docketed him as 908 through 919. They walked his biography, his businesses, his ties to Civello, his proximity to bookmakers and judges, and every contradictory sentence about Jack Ruby. They asked about the Egyptian, the Par 5 Club, the Vegas junkets, the insurance license, the $200,000 settlement with Sam's widow. They pressed the old murder and the way Dallas handled self-defense. They etched the network in the record. Pull it back to November '63, and the line holds. Dallas had power players tied to Chicago and New Orleans. Some of those men funneled money to Johnson's people and bought themselves insulation. The local cops answered the same donors who liked their oil sweet and their unions quiet. The federal picture, Castro, Cuba, communists, made good front-page copy. The ground truth, restaurants, bars, wire rooms, private clubs, envelopes, ran through men like Civello and Campisi and up the highway to Marcello. Ferry's warrant burned a day or two, then cooled. Bannister's name stayed in a drawer. Oswald's arrest forced Ruby's hand. The plan to kill the patsy in a ditch turned into a killing on live television. And the lawyers, the same Washington hands who'd spent the fall working one job only, filed their motions, fought the deportation case, and kept the boss out of a cell while the country argued about motive. By the time the committees finished years later, the record had what it always has. Fragments, contradictions, sworn facts that line up with sworn facts that don't. But the chapter reads the same to anyone who's worked a back room. In October, Marcello watched Valachi on TV and measured the damage. In November, he trusted the math. Keep it tight, place the pieces, control the blame, and if a piece doesn't move the way you planned, remove it and move the next. By 1963, Carlos Marcello knew the ledger. He could read leverage the way other men read ledgers. Who owed what, who could be bought, who could be frightened back into line. He'd been pushed into a corner by Robert Kennedy, and he'd answered the squeeze by knitting himself to the Cuban exiles and to the people who ran America's dirty wars. That alliance bought him access no other mobster could claim. Close contact with CIA-backed exile teams, cutouts in Langley, veterans of OSS operations who'd never forgotten how to get things done in the grey. The relationship didn't spring up overnight. It began with jobs in the 1940s, Operation Underworld, Operation X, the old bargain between the Office of Strategic Services and the mob to keep the docks from sabotage. From those early deals came networks, Sicily, French Corsica, ports and politics, controlled with a combination of muscle and paperwork. By 1954, those networks had a corporate hand on them too, United Fruit, and the men who moved its cargo and its influence. When Jacobo Arbenz threatened those holdings in Guatemala, the same coalition, intelligence, corporate, and criminal, backed a media campaign, funneled cash, bribed officers, and helped the CIA run a coup. That was the pattern: covert action dressed up as necessity, and the Mafia sliding into the seams. Then came Castro. The island changed the calculus. The mob smelled profit in Havana under Batista. Castro destroyed that market and panicked old men who'd staked fortunes on gambling and grease. The CIA and the exiles thought they could turn things back. The mob thought it could cut a deal. None of it stayed tidy. Operations multiplied, lines blurred, and 1,000 small cells of violence and betrayal started to look like policy. Somewhere inside that blur was Lee Harvey Oswald, a lost kid who wanted purpose, who wanted to mean something. He drifted. Mexico, an odd allegiance to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a dangerous impatience. In Langley and in the back rooms, men with code names and men with criminal records watched him. David Atlee Phillips and other operatives moved among exiles in Mexico City. David Ferry, the flight instructor and oddball with connections to right-wing exile circles, made it his business to find and groom recruits. Oswald fit a pattern: vulnerable, suggestible, useful. Marcello didn't need to hold the whole plan in his hands. He never did. He worked by leverage and suggestion. He knew which buttons to press, which favors to call in, which men to steer into the same room. By October, he could see the schedule lining up. The teams in Mexico had made contact. Somebody had whispered to Oswald that he could get to Cuba, that he could get a role, that he could be useful. The old tradecraft, direction, rehearsal, the right men in the right places, made Oswald look like a recruit. That was the first half of the scheme, a patsy who could be placed. The other half was simpler and cruder. The price on Kennedy's head was clearer than any Castro contract. For men who saw the president's policies as a threat to influence and money, hitting Dallas carried its own value. Marcello leaned to Ferrier and said what needed saying. Castro was a poor prize. Kennedy was the real return. Ferrier, who hated the Kennedys and had a record of bravado, needed no convincing. He had debts, legal headaches, and a place in Marcello's orbit that made compliance cheaper than defiance. Ferry told Oswald he could be backed. He promised an extraction plan, a getaway pilot, cash, safety. He promised trust. He was the one Oswald might listen to. Ferry had been in his life since the Civil Air Patrol days, since the mid-1950s, when the kid was still looking for a role to play. So the pieces were pushed. Ferry primed. Oswald fed lines and grievances. Phillips and his contacts in Mexico moved against Castro's network in ways that made the line between intelligence and deniable actor thinner than ever. Marcello's hand was not a public one. He hid behind lawyers, junkets, and polite dinners. But his influence rested in predictable places. Men who owed him favors, flights that could be arranged, people in Dallas with pockets and local muscle. On November 21st, plans were supposedly set. Someone would be where he needed to be. Someone else would be elsewhere. Someone would make sure Oswald was left where the path led. Marcello wanted plausible deniability. He wanted distance. He wanted the job done, so the paper trail never led home. He wanted the kind of work he'd done 100 times. Silence, a clean exit, a closure that killed inquiry. But the violence of improvisation is different from the violence of a ledger. Oswald didn't exit the way the men had imagined. He was arrested. He shouted, "I'm just a patsy," on television, an unplanned, naked confession that would not vanish. The plan that depended on bodies, on timing, on men following scripts, broke open. The streets filled with cameras. The world watched. Jack Ruby was brought in because a live, talking Oswald could not be left alive. Ruby, the nightclub operator with quick hands and a faster temper, walked into that room, and ended the paradox. He ended it the only way a nightclub man knew how: sudden, public, violent. And in doing so, sealed the kind of chain reaction the planners had feared, and the lawmen had never anticipated. Marcello had always understood risk. He had always preferred a long ledger to a short shot. This time the shot ricocheted. The men who thought they could thread assassination and deniability into national policy found out the hard lesson. When you make a patsy, you still deal with a human being. Humans shout. Humans get arrested. Humans change the story. And when that happens, even the best-laid bargains, between bosses and bureaucrats, between exiles and spooks, can collapse into a public mess that chews men up and eats reputations for breakfast. In Carlos Marcello's world, silence was survival. Nobody said his name. Nobody. Not even in a whisper. Not even if you were sitting across from the district attorney himself. Jim Garrison was that district attorney in New Orleans, a man who, on the surface, looked like the law's sharp edge, but everyone in town knew he and Marcello went back years. Garrison had once called Marcello his political mentor. You could be in Garrison's office, staring him dead in the eye, and still know the rule: never say Carlos Marcello's name. Because in Marcello's orbit, protection and punishment came from the same hand. Speak too freely, and it wasn't just you who paid. It was your wife, your cousin, maybe even a brother you hadn't talked to in 10 years. Everyone you loved became collateral. When Kennedy was assassinated, every hustler and wise guy in New Orleans knew Oswald had ties to David Ferry, the eccentric ex-flight instructor with the glued-on hair, and the boys who drifted in and out of his life. Oswald was one of them. A Marine-turned-drifter, a sharpshooter who'd been groomed for something darker. After Dallas, Oswald was supposed to disappear. Everybody in Marcello's circle knew that. But when he didn't, when the kid got arrested instead of vanishing, things got dangerous. The word came down fast. Oswald had to die. In Houston, David Ferry got the message loud and clear. Ferry ran drugs, owed money, and lived under Marcello's shadow, one of a dozen little front CIA men who thought they were players, but were just pawns. Ferry was the one who told Ruby that if he didn't take Oswald out, someone else would. Worse, after Oswald they would come after Ruby, and for his family, his brother, his sister, the people who had nothing to do with the game. Ferry and his friends were staying in a hotel in Houston, then moved on to Galveston, Marcello territory, where the Maceo family handled the coast and funneled mob money through Cuban exile networks. These were men who'd been shipping cash and guns to anti-Castro fighters since the Bay of Pigs. Galveston wasn't a vacation spot for David Ferry. It was a warning and a threat being sent to Ruby. When Oswald was finally killed, shot on live TV in the basement of the Dallas Police Department, Ruby knew he'd done what he was told. But the story didn't end there. One man who made sure to watch that basement broadcast was David Ferry. He kept his eyes on the TV monitor until the shot was fired and Oswald went down. Nobody knows what went through his mind in that moment. Watching a kid who'd once looked up to him like a father figure collapse on live television. Maybe guilt, maybe relief, maybe nothing at all. What Ferry did know was that the job was finished. Jack Ruby had done what he was told, and the kid was dead. That meant it was safe to come home. So Ferry packed his bags and drove back to New Orleans, thinking the storm had passed. But waiting for him on the other side wasn't freedom. It was Jim Garrison. The same Garrison who called Carlos Marcello his friend and mentor. The same man who knew exactly whose lawyer Ferry had standing next to him when he walked through the door. Ferry wasn't just coming home. He was walking straight into the hands of the organization that had built him, used him, and now had to decide whether he was still worth keeping alive. When Ferry was questioned after the assassination, he didn't show up alone, like Oliver Stone's movie JFK suggested. He walked into Jim Garrison's office with one of Marcello's own lawyers, Ray Gill. The same lawyer who'd stood beside Marcello in court on the very day Kennedy was killed. The same lawyer who represented Ferry, Guy Bannister, and the mob's New Orleans operation. The same man who made sure Ferry walked free that day. Garrison let him go. The FBI cleared him too. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. But the press wouldn't let the story die. Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment, and his follow-up documentary threw gasoline on the fire. Suddenly, Garrison himself was under IRS and FBI investigation, just like Marcello and his syndicate. He needed a move, so in 1967 he launched his own investigation into the assassination. It was politics, self-preservation, and revenge all rolled into one. Meanwhile, Ruby's world was collapsing. His clubs were bleeding cash. His laundromat was a front for Marcello's money, and his debts were being called in. When Marcello was deported to Guatemala in 1961, Ruby thought the old man was finished. He skimmed from the top, thinking nobody would notice. But Marcello came back. He always came back. And when he did, he knew down to the dollar what was missing. Ruby was on the hook from that day forward. Marcello's men in the Union squeezed him, the loan sharks bled him, and the promise dangled in front of him was simple. Do your job on November 22nd, and the slate is clean. Miss and you'll die slow, and they'll take your family first. Ruby understood the terms. When Oswald's arrest blew the plan, the clean-up fell to him. He had to do it himself. And he did, on live television, in the most public execution in American history. The aftermath played out like every Marcello cleanup. Quiet payouts, sudden deaths, and stories that didn't match. Ruby's family didn't go hungry. His brother walked into a Las Vegas casino in the late 1960s, placed one bet, and walked out a wealthy man. The casino was later identified by the FBI as one of Carlos Marcello's properties. In the strange world of Carlos Marcello, that was how debts were paid and silence was bought. You didn't talk. You didn't ask. And you sure as hell didn't say his name. Even if you were Jim Garrison. Even if you were Oliver Stone in 1991. On November 29, 1963, the phone rang at Joe Campisi's house. Dallas County Sheriff Bill Decker was on the line. Jack Ruby wanted to see him. The next day, November 30th, Joe and his wife walked into the jail and sat with Ruby for roughly 10 minutes. Ruby didn't explain why he'd killed Oswald, and Joe didn't ask. There was no talk of prior acquaintance with Oswald. What Ruby did say was that he felt deeply for Mrs. Kennedy, and when he said it, he broke down. Then he asked the question that really brought him to the glass. What did people think? What did his friends think? How did it play on the street? The street said plenty. Ruby and Campisi shared a small constellation of names that mattered in Dallas. Russell Matthews, Benny Binion, James Jimmy Todd, John Grisaffi, Ralph Paul, Tony Zoppi. Joe had gone to school with Matthews. He called Binion and Todd friends. He bought the Egyptian restaurant from Grisaffi. And years later, in 1966, Grisaffi and Johnny Petrono came back around with a deal they wanted the Campisi brothers to stake. Ralph Paul, who ran the bullpen and was Ruby's closest friend, got called Joe's partner in one FBI interview, an exaggeration that doesn't survive the paperwork. Joe told investigators he only knew Paul through Ruby. He was also friendly with Abe Weinstein, one of Ruby's nightclub rivals. And Joe flew to Las Vegas, often enough that it made his file. 15 years after the jailhouse visit, the House Select Committee on Assassinations swore Joe in at the federal building in Dallas, courtroom 16, F23. Campisi gave his address, 4445 Ashford Drive, and his occupation, restaurant man. The Egyptian Restaurant, Incorporated. He'd been at that location 28 years. Counsel John Hornbeck read him his rights and the ground rules. Voluntary appearance, right to counsel, right to refuse on self-incrimination, and the warning about perjury. Joe said he understood. He had one concern. Were they going to ask about names? If they named a man, did he have to say he knew him? He was told he didn't have to answer anything he didn't want to. The session could pause if needed. He nodded. They started with Jack. Joe met Ruby in 1947, downtown Dallas, Maine, and St. Paul, in a little bar Joe ran. A jewelry salesman named Milton Joseph, Chicago by way of Dallas, brought Ruby by and made the introduction. Ruby already had the Silver Spur on Hervé, a hillbilly joint with live bands in a rough part of town. Joe saw it once, maybe twice. The next stop in Ruby's hustle was the Las Vegas Club, then the Carousel. Joe met Ruby's sister Eva later at the Vegas Club and saw her 2 or 3 times. Ruby never talked Chicago history with Joe. No union talk, no famous names, no backstory. If he bragged to others, Joe didn't hear it. Through the late 40s and into 63, Joe and Ruby would nod across rooms, swap a word or two, sometimes sit through an amateur hour at the Vegas Club, Friday nights, late. Joe usually worked Fridays. Ruby pushed him to come anyway. He was funny, Joe said, a little dizzy. Ruby emceed his own stage, barked the jokes, settled the beefs. If someone got out of line, he handled it personally. Joe watched him do it. One night at the Vegas, Ruby came shaking down the front tables for $5 tickets to an after-hours party for one of the girls who's pregnant. Joe and his friends, Frankie Tortorella and J.C. Adams, kidded him, paid the $15, and kept the bit going by slipping the tickets into the pocket of a drunk who'd wandered past complaining about a DWI. Ruby finished his act, came for the stubs, found nothing at the table, and hauled the drunk into a little clothes closet. Joe heard the thumps. When Ruby came out, the drunk went out, hard. "Time for me to leave," Joe said, and left. Another time at the Carousel, the room had Jada on stage and an MC who liked to needle the crowd. A loud kid ruined the set with heckles. Joe said they couldn't hear the show. Ruby walked over and warned him, "You've got to be quiet now." 10 minutes later, the kid started again. Ruby asked Joe, "Is that class?" Joe said yes. Then the kid pushed it again, and Ruby crossed the room and drilled him without a word. That was how the joint stayed upright. "We used to tell him, 'Jack, you're going to get a knife stuck in your stomach.' He'd fight anybody," Joe said. "He'd go outside and fight young boys." There were smaller scenes that told the same story. One night round 1 a.m., Joe and Frankie climbed the Carousel stairs to say hello. Ruby showed off his 2 dogs. "I love these dogs." Joe cracked, "What if they wake up one morning and tell you, 'Jack, we love you'?" Ruby laughed. A drunk came up the steps, hugging a 5th of bourbon. Midnight curfew meant no drinking. Ruby set a $2 cover. Joe told him to make it a double or nothing coin flip. The drunk lost, paid for, tried to drink anyway, and Ruby grabbed the bottle and shoved $2 back. Joe told him it ought to be 4. Ruby said, "No, he's been in." Then Ruby bounced him, down the last flight, 1 shot at a time. The man got up, threatened to come back, and kept walking. In that world you learned that the bouncer's first punch was the last word. Ruby's relationship with the police? "They all knew Jack," Joe said. "He had a lot of friends." That was the whole sentence. Back to the jailhouse visit. Joe told the committee he got the request from Sheriff Decker on November 29th and saw Ruby the next day. Ruby didn't confess a motive. He didn't claim prior knowledge of Oswald. He cried over Mrs. Kennedy and wanted a weather report on public opinion. Joe gave him what he had. Then he went home. The committee pinned down the network. Ruby and Joe had documented overlaps: Matthews, Binion, Todd, Grisaffi, Paul, Zoppi, and a friendly line to Abe Weinstein. The Egyptian had come from Grisaffi. Petrono tried to pull Joe and Sam into a 66 play. The infamous partner tag with Ralph Paul didn't hold water. It was a loose tongue in an FBI interview, and nothing more. The Vegas flights flagged Joe as a man with business west of the state line. Not unusual for a Dallas operator with friends in the show trade and the gaming racket. The transcript shows the rest in routine. The oath, the rights, the hesitations, the narrow answers. Joe kept it where he always kept it, inside the walls of his restaurant. He told them what he'd seen. Ruby ran his rooms himself, broke up trouble bare-knuckled, and knew cops by first name. When the world crashed in after November 22nd, the first instinct he heard from Ruby wasn't legal strategy or political theory. It was human and vain in the same breath. How do I look? What do my people think? In Dallas, that answer was never written on letterhead. It was carried from bar to bar, booth to booth, table to table, the way news moves when it's nobody's business and everybody's story. And at 5610 East Mockingbird Lane, where the Egyptian steak knives clinked against plates, the man who heard it all kept serving dinner and kept his sentences short. Cops drifted through Jack Ruby's rooms the way smoke clings to a ceiling. You'd see them up at the carousel after hours, vice men mostly, standing by the rail, watching the show, nodding to the owner who doubled as his own bouncer. I wasn't a regular. 4, 5, maybe 6 times, always as part of a small crowd, never early. We'd hit a hotel act, then slide by Ruby's place late to catch whatever was left on stage. People said Ruby had union trouble with the strippers and musicians in '63. He never brought it to me, and I never heard it straight. What I did see was how he worked a room outside the club. At fights, he made the rounds, shaking hands like a precinct captain. I spotted him once at a cowboy game at the Cotton Bowl. Same routine, the public man with a private business that ran on his personality and his rules. He kept 2 dogs upstairs at the carousel, dachshunds maybe. I never knew the breed. He loved those animals. One night, he brought them out, cradling them like trophies. I wisecracked, "What if they tell you, Jack, we love you?" He laughed, because sentiment played better in his voice than you'd expect from a guy who could put you down a staircase without wrinkling his jacket. Women were everywhere in that line of work, but he wasn't a ladies' man. Not the way people like to say after the fact. He had one redhead he'd been with a long time. I never saw him parade anyone else. Whatever love he had beyond that, he didn't live it in front of me. When they grabbed him after he shot Oswald, he had a couple grand in his pocket. Somewhere in an FBI write-up, there's a line that I said he operated out of his hip pocket. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. If I said it, I meant the obvious. He paid cash for things. But I didn't know the nuts and bolts of his books. I knew he took $2 at the door. I didn't sit there while he cut envelopes for the talent. Once I told him, "It's a shame you've got to stay open this late to make a buck." That was the carousel. Late hours, strong coffee, noise. The Las Vegas club, he pushed it to 2 a.m., but it wasn't a hard drinking joint so much as a show and dance room. As for Vice, here's what I heard and what I didn't. The talk was some of the girls who danced also turned tricks. Word of mouth said the Vice boys would spot a known pro and tell Jack, and Jack would let her go. I never saw gambling in his rooms. I never saw him play cards. A reporter printed that he and I ran regular games. Never happened. Ruby came to my house once, one time in all the years I knew him. I was grilling steaks in the yard. He ate, said he had to get to work, and left. No cards, no smoke-filled legends. His club wasn't a classy room. Strip joints aren't. He didn't draw the best clientele, and he knew it. The Colony Club, Abe Weinstein's place, had the better acts. That stung. They were neighbours in the trade, and there was a little jealousy in the air, the kind that starts when one owner thinks the other is poaching a dancer. Jack stretched his hours to catch Abe's overflow. Competition, not blood feud. I'd known Abe for years. I ate in his place. He ate in mine. I knew his kids. Friends, not partners. When the Colony leaned harder into striptease, I stopped going. Not my thing. Sports betting, bookmaking, not from what I saw, not from what I heard. If he put a bet down, it wasn't in front of me. The week of the motorcade, people say Ruby and his closest friend Ralph Paul ate steaks at my restaurant, the Egyptian, on Thursday night. I wasn't on shift. My brother Sam worked that night. Later, the bureau talked to Sam and wrote that Ruby and Paul came in around 9:45 or 10 p.m., ate, and were gone in 45 minutes. Could be. I don't remember discussing it with Sam at the time. I read the report after. It wasn't a big conversation in my house. That was Jack Ruby, as I knew him. A showman who policed his own floor, sentimental about two little dogs, jealous of a better room down the street, cash in the pocket, cops at the rail, and a temper that solved problems in a punch. In Dallas, you didn't need myth to explain a man like that. You just needed to watch him work. A few days after Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, Joe Campisi's phone rang. Dallas County Sheriff Bill Decker. Ruby had made a list of closest friends he wanted to see. Joe's name was on it. So was his wife, Marie's. They went up to the jail. Joe thinks it was a Sunday. Small cell. A deputy sitting inside. Hi, Jack. Hi, Joe. Hi. Marie Ruby's first question wasn't about lawyers or strategy. What are the people saying about me? Joe told him straight. Not much. Ruby drifted to pride and identity. Something like, Jews have class. Nobody but me could do it. Then the emotion hit. Here I am fighting for my life and feeling sorry for myself, when I really feel sorry for Mrs. Kennedy and the kids. He cried. Joe had never seen him do that. Ruby didn't say why he killed Oswald, and Joe didn't ask. Before they left, Ruby snapped back into club owner mode. Tell that damn Milton Joseph he's still barred from my club. Milton, the jewelry salesman from Chicago who first introduced Joe to Jack back in '47, had fallen out with Ruby years earlier. Jealousy, a girl, an overpriced trinket. No one could pin it down. It became a running joke in Dallas. Tease Ruby that Milton had jilted him and watch him flare. Later, during the trial, Joe kidded Milton. Come down to the courthouse. Biggest mistrial you'll ever see. Ruby will jump the rail at you. Milton passed. The Bureau interviewed Joe on December 7th, 1963, about the jail visit. The writer didn't note Marie's presence. Joe says he told them she'd been there. The memo attributes lines to him he can't fully place now. Ruby bragging he got lots of mail and all the girls love me, asking if friends were mad and what Joe thought of his lawyer. Joe doesn't remember those. He does remember Ruby's line about Mrs. Kennedy and the kids. As for politics, Ruby never talked it with Joe. No Kennedy talk before the shooting. Ruby wasn't a soapbox guy with him. Tom Howard was Ruby's first attorney. Joe knew Howard by reputation, a good criminal lawyer in those days. They never discussed the case. Howard never represented Joe. Joe hadn't needed a lawyer until a civil suit, decades later. Joe didn't contribute to Ruby's defense. He visited once, didn't go back. The FBI came around after, and that was that. He stood in the back of the courtroom one day during the trial, then left. No insider scuttle on outcomes. Dallas would learn what everyone else learned, on the nightly news. The committee lawyers pressed timelines and names. They asked if staff at the Egyptian ever flagged Ruby's Thursday night steak before the motorcade. Joe didn't work Thursdays. His brother Sam did. An FBI report quotes Sam, "Ruby and Ralph Paul came in around 9:45 to 10 p.m. 8. Stayed 45 minutes. Joe read that later. He doesn't remember talking about it with Sam at the time. They asked about a pre-stridge. Joe knew a Ralph Presley, maybe the same man. He thought he was Lois Green's nephew. He'd met him at the restaurant. No business with him, no sense of ties to Ruby beyond the city's usual overlaps. Cuba came up. Joe had heard, street talk, that Ruby went in 1959. He knew Louis McWillie from the gambling world before that trip, and he'd gone to school with R.D. Matthews, another gambler. The way Joe heard it, Ruby may have gone to see McWillie. Matthews was around. The name Santos got mentioned in the wind. Trafficante. Years later, Joe saw McWillie in Las Vegas, working the blackjack pit at the Horseshoe, Benny Binion's place. By then, Matthews was in Vegas too, working for Binion. Joe had known the Binion name since he was a kid. They finally met out there. They asked about Tony Zoppi, the nightlife columnist turned Riviera man. Joe knew him from the morning news days, family dinners at the Egyptian, a column here and there. They'd joke about Ruby. He's crazy. Yeah, he's crazy. Those exchanges happened before November '63. Just two men who knew the rooms and the temper of the man who ran one of them. In the end, Joe's chapter stayed tight. Decker's call. One jail visit with Marie. Ruby's vanity and regret in the same breath. No politics, no motive offered. A city's lattice of names, Milton Joseph, Ralph Paul, McWillie, Matthews, Zoppi, Binion, drawn with the steady hand of a restaurateur who kept his sentences short and his doors open. The rest was what Dallas always ran on. Rumours that sounded like facts, and facts that sounded like rumours, repeated until they hardened into memory. The name came slow, letter by letter, the way lawyers like to nail a thing to the wall. Trafficante. Santos. R.D. Matthews told Joe Campisi he'd worked for him in Cuba. Good boss, treated him right. No origin story, no dates, no hotel names. Just the outline. A casino man under a casino king. McWillie went down, Matthews went down. Joe only heard after they were already gone. Vegas was the afterlife. Years later, Joe spotted McWillie in the blackjack pit at the Horseshoe, Binion's joint, while Matthews drifted between the Horseshoe and a golf course, pouring drinks and invites. When the Sahara ran its anniversary tournament, Joe swung a club, shook hands, skipped the dinners. Matthews offered a comp. Joe was too tired to cash it. Dallas had its own roll call. Johnny Ross Patrono, meat market as a kid, dealing dice at 13 when the town was open, maybe a little bookmaking on the side. Open meant 44 to 45, wartime heat and easy money, before Will Wilson took the DA's chair and shut the dice down. By 47 to 48, the wind had changed. A crew out of Chicago tried to buy Sheriff Steve Guthrie, wiretaps, envelopes, and talk about bringing syndicate muscle to take over Dallas. Paul Roland Jones got convicted. Joe remembered him only as a face at the restaurant. No background, no bets, no memories of Jones with Ruby. Just a table check and the door. Bobby Joe Chapman was the bookmaker everyone knew by name, a lifer in the sheets. Joe knew him 3 decades, finally met him 25 years back. Ruby knew him the same way Joe did, the city's handshake level. No bets placed by Ruby through Chapman that Joe ever saw or heard. Jimmy Voorhis ran the chateau and loved action. He gambled, Joe said, bet anything. That was Dallas, restaurateurs who booked tables, bookmakers who booked Sundays, and a nightlife columnist like Tony Zoppi, who wrote it all up for the morning news before moving to the Riviera. Joe and Zoppi would laugh about Ruby. He's crazy. Yeah, he's crazy. Those were pre-63 conversations. Two men who'd seen Ruby clear rooms with a punch and a grin. Washington's pressure arrived in '61 with Robert Kennedy. Word on the street was a federal grand jury who was coming gambling. Maybe it did. Joe doesn't remember the hammer falling, only the murmur about a new statute, 5-man conspiracy, and bookmakers quietly asking lawyers how many chairs at a table turned a game into a felony. The city adjusted. It always did. Cards. Joe wasn't a regular. He'd sit in on a soft game at Glen Lake Country Club with members, never with pros. The idea that Ruby and Joe played together was fantasy. One steak on Joe's patio, that's it. Ruby ate, said he had to work, and left. No cards, no cash, no smoke. Then the supply chain, real Dallas, where money lives. Joe knew the Civellos his whole life. They ran Civello's liquor store and imported foods, pastas, provolone, tomato paste. The Egyptian bought from them until Shep's Wholesale started bringing in contadina and beat the price. Charlie Civello called to complain. How can they sell cheaper? We buy from the same broker. Joe's answer was simple and correct. That's your problem. We're here to save money. No threats, no boycott, no hard feelings, just business. Cuba still hovered at the edge of the frame. Joe heard, street talk, that Ruby went in 1959. McWillie was there, Matthews too. The name Santos floated in the chatter and landed where it always lands in that era. Trafficante. Joe never discussed Santos with Ruby. Ruby never brought him up. Whatever was traded between Dallas, Havana, and Vegas moved through other hands. That's how the map looks when you take the deposition stenograph and unspool it into a life. Trafficante spelled out like a summons. Matthews loyal to a boss in Havana. McWillie resurfaced on Fremont Street. Chapman on the line. Patrono dealing as a kid back when the dice still clicked. A crooked Chicago pitch to Sheriff Guthrie that didn't stick. And a city that closed without ever really going dark. In the middle, Joe Campisi kept his restaurant moving. Buying cheaper tomatoes when cheaper tomatoes showed up, serving the steak, spotting the faces, and keeping the kind of memory that's precise about prices and hazy about gossip. In a town built on rumor and receipts, that's how you survive. Shep's Grocery was a Dallas institution. Joe Campisi bought his supplies there for years. The old man, Mr. Shep's, was gone now, his son dead in a plane crash, and one of the younger kids ran it. They carried contadina tomatoes, the same ones Joe switched to when he stopped buying from the Civellos. It wasn't personal, it was business. Joe Civello never asked why he quit buying. His brother Charlie did. We get them from the same broker. How can they sell cheaper? Charlie complained. Joe just shrugged. That's your problem. We're here to save money. The Civellos were like family, close as cousins. But when it came to business, Joe kept the line clean. He never asked Joe Civello about the Appalachian arrest back in '57, and Civello never brought it up. None of my business, Joe said. He meant it. When the committee lawyer asked if he knew the Marcellos from New Orleans, Joe smiled. I know Vincent, he said, and I met Mr. Carlos maybe 6 years ago. The irony was rich. For years, people swore he was tied to Carlos Marcello, the boss who supposedly reached from Jefferson Parish to Washington. But Joe hadn't even met the man. He met Vincent first, on a junket flight out of New Orleans. They shook hands at the airport. Months later, Joe ran into him at a party. They talked, hit it off. Mardi Gras, the fairgrounds racetrack. Occasional encounters turned into a loose friendship. Vincent was a golfer, so was Joe. They started playing together. Joe had known their brother Joe Marcello, the restaurateur, before any of them. But at first he wouldn't go near the Marcello place in New Orleans. I was scared, he admitted. The reputation alone kept him away. He told the story with a grin. Frank Lecoq, he's dead now. and I had a little money tied up in an apartment project. Frank says, "We're going to eat at Elmwood." I said, "No, I'm going somewhere else tonight." He said, "You mean you're scared to go there?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Then move to Russia. You live in America. What are you scared of?" Joe laughed. He made his point. Next trip, he went. Had dinner. Met the brothers. Over time, he met Sammy Marcello at a football game, Cowboys exhibition down in New Orleans, just waved from the stands. Sammy barely waved back, probably wondering who the hell the guy was. Later, Joe became a member guest at one of Vincent's golf outings, met Anthony Marcello, and the friendship stuck. Anthony came to Dallas once for a gift show. Vincent warned him, "After you meet Joe, he won't leave you alone. He'll take you to every restaurant in town." They all laughed about it for years. Joe only met Carlos 4 times in his life. First time was at Town and Country in New Orleans. Anthony took him to the office, made introductions, quick handshake, which was it. Second time they drove down to Grand Isle, to Carlos's fishing camp. Joe cooked spaghetti sauce for the crew, stayed 4 or 5 hours, drove back. Third time was another fishing trip. Fourth was the reopening of Broussard's restaurant. They talked occasionally by phone. Carlos once asked if Joe needed crab claws or soft shells. Every Christmas, Joe sent 260 pounds of Italian sausage, his own recipe, with walnuts and celery, to the brothers and cousins in Louisiana. "Why 260 pounds?" the lawyer asked. Joe shrugged. "No reason. I just send it to everybody. It was family, not business. No gambling, no deals." He and Vincent played golf but never bet. At the racetrack, Vincent gave him a horse once. "It ran last," Joe said. He'd never met Lawrence Myers from Chicago, or Jim Braden, the oil lease man who turned up in the Dallas jail the day of the assassination. He did know Jack Todd, an old neighborhood friend since they were teenagers, but Todd and Ruby never had business together. He remembered a big guy named Dolan, saw him at his restaurant and at Tennyson Park Golf Course 15 years back. Maybe Matthews introduced them. Joe figured Dolan was a gambler. I didn't know about any union connections, boxing, or criminal record. Just another big man in the Dallas mix. 2 Johnny Grisaffis came up, one with a Z, one with an S. Joe knew them both. One worked down at the courthouse. The other, Johnny Grisaffi, had once owned the restaurant Joe bought. Both probably knew Ruby. Everyone in Dallas did, in one way or another. As for Chicago connections, none, Joe said. Only guy I ever knew from Chicago was a boy named Rick Kakaris, a professional pickpocket. He taught me how to steal watches. Not the football player, a showman. Kakaris worked banquets, pretending to be public relations, then lifted wallets for laughs. No, Joe never met Nofio Pecora, never met Frenchie Meadlevain, never got invited to Cuba by Ruby, Matthews, or anyone else. Never met Al Zuckerman from Chicago. When the lawyers called him back after a short recess, they circled around to the old names again. High Fader, Ruby's one-time partner in show bookings. Joe figured Fader wasn't a big success. Tried to book bands and one-night gigs, maybe ran a rug-cleaning business on the side. Got into financial trouble. Family moved to California. That was the end of him. Ralph Paul came up next, Ruby's partner in later years. Joe remembered him only as an older man, an elderly fellow, a close friend of Ruby's but nothing more. That's how it went in Campisi's world. Names, fragments, memories like clippings. People everyone in Dallas knew, but nobody really knew. From Sheps's tomatoes to Carlos Marcello's crab claws, from junket golf to pickpocket tricks, Joe's life sat right where the city's underworld brushed the daylight, close enough to smell it, careful enough never to touch it. Shep's grocery ran on legacy. The old man was gone, one son lost in a plane crash, a younger son running the place now. They carried contadina, good price, steady supply. That's why Joe Campisi stopped buying tomatoes from the Civellos. Nothing personal, just business. He was close to Joe and Charlie Civello, like cousins. But when Charlie griped that Sheps was undercutting them while buying from the same broker, Joe didn't flinch. That's your problem. We're here to save money. He never asked Joe Civello about Appalachian. Civello never volunteered. None of my business, Joe said, and left it there. Marcello. Joe knew Vincent. He met Carlos late, maybe 6 years back, long after gossip had tied their names together. He met Vincent on a junket out of New Orleans, saw him again at a party months later, then here and there at Mardi Gras or the track. He'd known their brother Joe, the restaurateur, first. For years he refused to eat at the Marcello family place. The reputation spooked him. His friend Frank Lecoq razzed him. Move to Russia if you're that scared. So Joe went, had dinner, and met the crew. Over time he waved to Sammy at football games, played golf as Vincent's guest, and got to know Anthony. When Anthony came to Dallas for a gift show, Vincent warned him with a laugh. After you meet Joe, he won't leave you alone. He'll feed you everywhere. It became a running joke. Joe met Carlos 4 times, all in Louisiana. Town and country, quick handshake in an office. Grand Isle, Carlos's camp, where Joe cooked spaghetti sauce and stayed a few hours. Another fishing camp later. Then the reopening of Broussard's. They spoke by phone a couple of times. Carlos once asked if Joe needed crab claws or soft shells. Every Christmas, Joe shipped 260 pounds of his Italian sausage, walnuts, celery, divided among brothers and cousins. Family gestures, not business. He and Vincent never bet on golf. At the track, Vincent gave him a horse. It ran last. Ralph Paul. I just knew him with Jack, Joe said. No separate relationship. Amateur night at the Las Vegas club was pure draw. Ruby called it amateur. Got women to strip for attention, maybe for the promise of Hollywood. It beat the cost of pros. Competitors weren't worried. Abe Weinstein ran the colony and didn't need gimmicks. If Ruby did an amateur hour at the Carousel, Joe didn't remember it. The after-hours ticket he bought was for a pregnant employee, $5 for a party room at the Holiday on Central. He didn't go. He never heard of Ruby throwing many of those. Gamblers. Johnny Stone booked. He probably knew Ruby, Joe said. Joe bet football himself, knew bookmakers across Dallas. If Ruby had taken action, placed through someone, or collected, I would have heard about it. I never did. The 1961 Tropicana verses. McDonough's suit meant nothing to him. Benny Binion, part of Dallas, then Vegas, moved when the town closed in '46. Joe didn't know Michael Shaw, Alex Gruber, Erwin Weiner, Alan Dorfman, or Barney Baker. Jada, the dancer, came out of New Orleans, maybe Bourbon Street, married to a junior. Joe didn't know if Junior had mob ties. He never heard of Harold Tannenbaum. Vice Squad faces showed up at the Carousel. Joe recognized the type, not the names. When Ruby shot Oswald, Joe's first thought was simple. He's crazy. He caught a replay on TV, thought it was live, shouted for his wife, then learned it was a rebroadcast. In jail days later, Ruby asked, "What are people saying about me?" and cried over Mrs. Kennedy and the kids. Joe didn't ask him why he did it. "You're spellbound," he said. "You don't know what to say." Cuba stayed in the margins. Joe didn't discuss Santo Traficante with Ruby, McWillie, or the Marcellos. R.D. Matthews once said he worked for Traficante in Cuba. Good boss, treated him right, but gave Joe no details. Joe never went to Cuba, never got invited by Matthews or Ruby. Sheriff Bill Decker was family. Like a son, Joe said. The Deckers knew the Italian families. Joe grew up stopping by the courthouse to sit and talk. Lois Green, too. And Joe knew him all his life. That's how he first met Ralph Prestridge, Green's nephew. No business either. He first heard Kennedy was shot while driving. Scared me to death, Joe said. Could it happen in Dallas? It could happen anywhere. As for organized crime, he asked the lawyers for a definition. They gave him the federal and the street versions. Joe gave them Dallas. If a 15 or 16-year-old wanted to be a bookmaker, he could set up a phone, find his customers, bank his own action, and his only problem was the police. He doesn't have to answer to anyone else, Joe said. Nobody muscling him, telling him he's got to do this or that. I don't think that ever happened in Dallas, Texas. At the end, the lawyers offered him 5 minutes to say anything he wanted. Joe passed. Jack Ruby is crazy, he said. That was his last word. The notary stamped it, May 1973, true and correct. Questions asked, answers short. Names fixed to a city that swore it didn't answer to anyone.